driver waiting outside.
Oh, okay. The first question I ask everybody is give me your first and last name, the years you attended Spelman College, and then the years you participated with the Atlanta Student Movement.
My name is June Gary Hobbs. You said first and last, but I go by Gary Hobbs also. And I attended Spelman in the late 50s. I graduated in 1960. And then I stayed in the city. I went right from Spelman to Atlanta University. So I participated in the activities in the late part of the 50s until I finished Atlanta U in 1962.
Okay. When we talk about those activities, why and what drew you? I mean, they were radical.
People say that the activities were radical. I'm not convinced that they were. They were radical, but I think you have to understand the context in which the activities occurred. First of all, the students were increasingly aware that the Old South had to change, that it could not exist. What drove that consciousness, I think, was first the return of the black GIs from World War II, starting then, and then the 1954 Supreme Court decision. When I was a child in school, when the Warren Court issued that decision, the bells were ringing, and the principal of the school where I attended, segregated school, had a meeting, and we were talking about it. So people were aware of it. Also, we were aware of the terrible tragedies that happened in an effort to maintain white supremacy. For example, in my high school, in my elementary school, when I was a child, the Moors were killed in South Florida. Miss Ann Moore was a member of my church, Mount Zion AME Church in Ocala, Florida, and she was the secretary at my school, Howard Academy. So we knew the struggle, although our parents had prepared us in how to manage it. You know, there were no mental health counselors in those days. People managed their healings by talking in communities, going to church, and getting on their knees praying. So there was a growing awareness among students that things would have to change. That was one. There was a growing awareness among many parents that things would change. Some parents would be vocal with their children about that, and others were more reticent, not because they didn't support the ideas, but they also knew very deeply the strong economic risk. And the other factor was that many faculty, particularly faculty at Spelman, were very open to the idea of change and that it was coming. So we were studying under those faculty. Many of them were new to the city. Howard Zinn, I'm sure you've heard his name, did his doctorate at Columbia. And Lois Moreland, Dr. Lois Moreland at Spelman. Zinn was at Spelman, Lois Moreland was at Spelman. She came to Spelman from Sarah Lawrence College and American University. We studied also under Bob Brisbane, who did his doctorate at Harvard. And Whitney Young, I think, played a major role that he doesn't get credit for in many contexts, mainly because he was at the Atlanta University School of Social Work, where I went after I left Spelman. But as you recall from history, he was the one who negotiated Martin Luther King's return to Atlanta from Birmingham. So, not Birmingham, I'm sorry, Montgomery. So, and he had a big impact on students, especially activist students, and his wife, Margaret Young, was a professor at Spelman and helped recruit several of us for the civil rights for this engagement and to go to the School of Social Work, which is in part how I ended up there, that he got my name when he recruited me through his wife. So I think that there was a growing awareness in our environment that things would change. that in a group of like-minded peers, there was no talk of fear. I grew up in a family where folks said, well, you know, this is what happened. We have to organize, we have to register to vote. And that went on in my household, even though there were great risks. And I can tell you some of those economic kind of risks later if we have time for that. At the same time in my family, I had relatives, cousins who didn't bother to vote. But my folks would go and pick up the teachers, pick up anyone who needed a ride to the polls.
Okay, we need to stop right here. We just lost the battery. Okay, we're going to pick it up. In your family concerning voting.
I had some family members, cousins, for example, who did not think it was worth their time to go and vote. At the same time, I had my parents and other aunts would go pick people up from the polls, take them. You know, they just assumed that risk. In that time, during that time, everyone didn't have a car. The polls were going to be placed really in places where it would not be easy for everyone to get to a polling place. I mean, that was the way you curtailed the black vote way back then. Well, of course, that's, I mean, Jim Crow was alive, so the effort was to stop black people from voting. So people went and voted. So I think there were other people like me who had parents who were quiet activists and not so quiet, and so we knew that they knew that some change would happen. Also, it was reinforced by the people at Spelman, and Dr. Brisbane was at Morehouse, who we had contact with. And then the third thing is, I think that in addition to just the question of civil rights in the South during that period, you cannot possibly get away from the problems of discrimination and poverty. And people saw this change as a way up and out. As I understand it, and as I read and think about it, in the South with families that I know, parents and grandparents put God first, they put family second, and they put education third. And therefore, you had to go get an education. So when there were some students in college who did not participate in the civil rights movement, I never felt it was because they were disinterested. They were very protective of their parents and their family's economic base. So it was easier, for example, for people like me. I grew up in Central Florida. Participating in the student activities here in Atlanta didn't have the same risk and impact for my family that some other families, some other students would have for their families, people who were local and worked for the state. For example, people who work for the city as a school, as the parents worked as school teachers in the city or in other close by or not so close by counties, people who had other public service jobs, and most of the jobs were public service, unless you were in very high black identified professions like medicine or law or dentistry, the ministry, and sometimes social work. But the bulk of the work was, in teaching. The post office, it wasn't so much of a problem. And the post office had been one of the first institutions to integrate way back, at the turn of the century anyway, until President Wilson put some barriers up. So that was the context. It was a need for change, understanding that that had to happen. There was a political necessity. There was an economic necessity. And so the academic environment, the academic community was a place where a lot of this could take place. And so why didn't it take place in Atlanta? I think we should note that the leaders of the movement on our campuses were people who had been away from the South. Rosalind Pope had been a Merrill Scholar, and she had studied in Paris and had enjoyed the freedoms of going by herself, not having to have an escort or check in with a house mother, where to go or what have you, and to go get coffee or tea or whatever she wanted whenever she wanted to with friends. Lonnie King was the head of the movement, the overall head, but he was chair of the Morehouse movement. He had been in the Navy, and he was just a few years older, but he had been exposed to more than the rest of us. Both of them had. Very few of us had been out of the country, some not much out of the state, and certainly not out of the region or to New York or D.C. So we had a very, I think, our worldview was different. The other point is that the faculty I mentioned were introducing us at the same time to the change that was going on here, was going on in other parts of the world, and particularly Africa. And we also had a number of people come in from Africa. Now, when I say a number, I don't mean 10 or 12, but smaller numbers, who spoke about shifts in that geopolitical region, what it meant there and what it was going to mean for us also. One person even told us we had no land and no rights. We ought to do something about it. But it was very informative to hear that. And these ideas resonated. Also, very talented writers and thoughtful persons and people who shaped public thought came and spoke at Spelman. I mean, the college brought them in, and they spoke at the Atlanta University Center. E. Franklin Frazier, for example, and several other people, too. But I remember E. Franklin Frazier talking about, I do this work to de-bamboozle my people, and we were always engaged in that kind of dialogue on the campus. So, in that sense, given our lived environment and the tragedies that had gone on around us, the movement was in a way different and radical, but it was one that should have been anticipated.
Since it wasn't anticipated and you had so many students involved, now when we go through these markers, we have one at Rush Memorial, we have one at like Pickwick, Heart of Atlanta Motel, we're going to have one at Hurt Plaza, one down at the state capitol, one at Riches, one for Freedom Riders, one at the attorney's offices, and there's always one is up on the Appeal for Human Rights, and the one for the foundation at Yates and Milton Drug Store.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. It seemed like, when we were just talking to Gwen Middlebrook, she talked about little individual rebellions she had done before she joined the movement. Did you have those personal little things that you did to strike the system? Was this like individual matches that ended up going up in one big flame?
Oh, well, when I was a child in Florida, where they would have the fountains, where they would have colored and white, we deliberately, we weren't thirsty, we just go drink out the white fountain, and so, that we were being, we were saying that I guess we just did it. And I grew up in a family now that was very proactive in the civil rights movement. And my mother was reassigned from her job as a school teacher. She wasn't going to get a job because she had signed a petition or she had advocated for equal pay for teachers. Our very dear family friend had lost his job as the principal of a school and went on to be the CEO of Central Life Insurance. Edward D. Davis was his name. So I would say that there was a very strong political awareness in my family. And just the rebellion to go and vote when it wasn't encouraged, and then to go pick up people to take them to vote. And as a child, we participated in that, you see. We would check with other people, are you going to be ready when my mother's going to pick you up or something like this. So I think those were small rebellions. I do know that, now, I didn't grow up in Atlanta. I grew up in Central Florida in a rural community. And so there wasn't as much chance to do some things as perhaps had I lived in an urban area. But as students at Spelman, we're supposed to ride on the bus, and we're supposed to ride on the back of the bus, but oftentimes we'd sit where we wanted on the bus. There was no one else on the bus. So, and we would. Dr. Zen would often go sit in the back. I don't know often, I don't know how, that's not the right word, because I don't know how many times he rode the bus, but I do know he would go sit in the back of the bus, where black folks were supposed to sit. So I think there were really aggressive actions taking place.
Now, let's talk about some of the individual marches. I mentioned Hurt Plaza, I mentioned the picketing at Pickett and Heart of Atlanta Hotel, and then I mentioned going down to the Capitol. Were you a participant in any of those?
I remember marching at Rich's. I marched at A&P. I went on several of the marches. I don't remember every one of them, but I remember I was in the very first one. I was in the first group to be arrested, Al Brunson and I. We were assigned to go to the depot, which was across the street, and I've forgotten if it was the Atlanta Journal and Constitution or Atlanta, but it was one of the big papers, which meant that as soon as we walked in, the press was right there. And if you get a copy of the paper, I was with Al, but he's holding the paper, so you see his picture, you do not see mine. In addition, when we were arrested and carried off in the paddy wagon and put in jail, I'm not sure they have everyone's name correctly, because my name was not spelled correctly. It was spelled incorrectly by whoever processed me. So I would imagine that happened. But I remember the night before we were going to participate, it was quiet, but in a couple of days before that, one of the things I remember doing was going around getting and talking with my colleagues in the dorm in Abbey Hall about signing up to participate. And everyone was interested. No one showed any disinterest. People were concerned. As I said, the students were very protective of their parents and the economic base, that my mother teaches school, my father works here. And by and large, a number of the students were in families where their parents were teachers or domestics or custodial people. They had to be mindful of that. And so that was a barrier, just the economic issues. Students said, well, we don't need to, our parents don't want us taking time out of school. They wouldn't like this. We heard that. That was probably true. But that was masking, I think, the economic and sociological reality of